Hello, and welcome to Conspiracy Theory and Political Culture, Past and Present, the conversation with the Atlantic's Adrienne LaFrance and James McAuley. My name is Sean Quimby. I'm the Penn Library's Associate University Librarian for Special Collections, Director of the J.I. Kislak Center, and your host this evening. Our program forms part of the Beitler Distinguished Lecture Series, so named for Lorraine Beitler, professor, interfaith and social justice advocate, as well as curator and collector of all things related to the Dreyfus affair. The Beitler collection includes more than 1,000 broadsides, newspapers, letters, and ephemera, and is held in Penn Library's Kislak Center. The program takes the fin de siècle scandal propelled by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and juxtaposes it against our contemporary political moment defined by Birtherism, Pizzagate, and QAnon, and which culminated ultimately, perhaps, in January's insurrection. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Lorraine Beitler, who we lost in 2019. Lance Donaldson Evans, Professor Emeritus in Penn's French Department and Chair of the Dreyfus Advisory Committee, is going to offer some brief reflections on her legacy. Lance.
Good evening. This is truly an evening to remember. Firstly, because it marks the resumption of a tradition. As Sean has said, the Lorraine Beitler Distinguished Lecture Series that was suspended during the pandemic. Secondly, because we have the opportunity to see and hear a brilliant panel whose members will be discussing subjects of vital importance to our democracy, subjects foreshadowed by the events of l'affaire Dreyfus, which took place in France from 1894 until 1906. However, it's also an evening to remember the late collector and curator of Penn's Dreyfus collection, Dr. Lorraine Beitler, as this is the first opportunity we have had to publicly honor her memory since her death in December of 2019. Dr. Lorraine Beitler was a professor of education who became passionately interested in the story of Alfred Dreyfus and its social and political ramifications. She began collecting material on all aspects of the Dreyfus case, dedicating her collection both to the use of scholars and as a vehicle of challenge, not only a challenge to anti-Semitism, but in fact to all forms of prejudice and bigotry. Lorraine made contact with the surviving members of the Dreyfus family and formed a deep friendship with Alfred Dreyfus's granddaughter, Simone Peil, who died in 2004. In fact, Alfred's great-granddaughter, Yael, was a member of our advisory committee for several years. Material from the Beitler collection has been exhibited in 10 countries and throughout the United States, including exhibitions at the US military and naval academies. Lorraine became friends with the late Professor Henri Mitterrand, world-renowned authority on Émile Zola, who wrote the famous open letter J'accuse in defense of Dreyfus. It was thanks to Henri's advice that Lorraine decided to gift her collection to Penn in 2002. Subsequently, Henri served on our advisory committee for a number of years, and we were all deeply saddened to learn of his death just 11 days ago. Since 2002, the library and the advisory committee have used the Beitler collection as a resource for scholars, as an educational tool, and as a way of promoting discussion of social and political issues. To give an example of the superb stewardship of the collection, the Van Pelt Library has created a digital version available online, as well as curricular materials to be used in presenting the collection's message to school children. However, Lorraine did not limit herself to her work on the collection. Her legacy includes, to name just two in a very long list, the establishment and funding of a grant that enables cadets from West Point to travel to the Holocaust Museum in Washington in order to learn from survivors the harm that bigotry can cause and why and how we must defeat it. And secondly, the transfer of a revered statue of Alfred Dreyfus from France to Israel, which was facilitated by Lorraine's intervention. And so we would like to dedicate this evening's proceedings to Lorraine's memory. She has been an inspiration to all of us who had the privilege of knowing her personally, as well as to those who have directly or indirectly benefited from her heritage. Lorraine, you are sorely missed. but your legacy continues, its flame burning as brightly and strongly as ever. Thank you from us all.
Thank you, Lance. And thanks to your colleagues on the advisory committee and to KISLAC's Director of Programs, Lynn Farrington, and to everyone who's helped to make this event possible, including our co-sponsor, the Annenberg School for Communications. Now, on with the program. Adrienne LaFrance is the executive editor of The Atlantic, where she previously served as senior editor and staff writer. She's been an investigative reporter for several local news organizations covering politics, technology, and media. Her June 2020 Atlantic article, The Prophecies of Q, bore the subtitle, American Conspiracy Theories Are Entering a Dangerous New Phase, and formed part of the magazine's Shadowland project on conspiracy thinking in America. For many people, it was an eye-opening piece exposing a pervasive and dangerous pseudo-religion, while for others, it simply helped to explain what so many friends, family members, and neighbors had come to believe. She's a native Philadelphian, and we're pleased to welcome her virtually back home this evening.
Thank you for having
me. Thank you, Adrienne. James McAuley is the Paris correspondent for the Washington Post and a contributor to the New York Review of Books. His story, France Knows How This Ends, Polarization, Anger, Division, French History Offers a Warning for What Might Come After Donald Trump, appeared in the January issue of The Atlantic. He holds a PhD in French from Oxford University, in French history, from Oxford University, and is the author of the recently released book, The House of Fragile Things. Its publisher, Yale University Press, describes it as, quote, a powerful history of Jewish art collectors in France and how an embrace of art and beauty was met with hatred and destruction. He joins us from Paris, where the time is 11:30 p.m., so we'll forgive him for an occasional yawn this evening. And finally, we're fortunate to have Sophia Rosenfeld. Thank you, James. Finally, we're fortunate to have Sophia Rosenfeld, Penn's Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and a friend of the KISLAC Center, here to moderate the conversation. She is the author of A Revolution of Language, The Problem with Signs in Late 18th Century France, Common Sense, A Political History, and Democracy and Truth, A Short History, as well as numerous articles in academic journals and major press outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, Dissent, and The Nation. The scope of her research and teaching is capacious, encompassing the Enlightenment, the transatlantic age of revolutions, and the legacy of the 18th century for modern democracy. She is, in other words, the perfect person to help us reflect on the lessons of the distant and not so distant past, and on the long-term prospects of the Enlightenment's influence on our world. Our panel will talk for about 40 minutes this evening before opening the floor to questions. So I encourage you all to enter your questions into the Q&A. You may not see them, but trust that we will be conveying them to Sophie. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn things over to Sophie.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sean, for those introductions. And let me start by thanking both our guests for being here and the whole audience. So I see there are quite a few participants tonight, which is wonderful. Who isn't interested in conspiracy theories these days, right? And both of our guests have written much talked about pieces, as Sean alluded to, about our topic tonight, including there's a brand new piece up by Adrienne LaFrance that I urge everybody to look at. It's coming out in the November issue of The Atlantic that tells us some scary things about Facebook, which we'll come to in a little bit. But I want to start with something maybe of a slightly more personal nature, something about the two of you. And obviously, as working journalists today, it would be impossible for anybody not to be interested in even a practical sense in fake news and conspiracy theories, in disinformation. But I'm wondering what drew the two of you to tackle it as an actual subject matter. And is there, maybe you could just say a few words to get us started about your own trajectories and how you ended up writing about the writing of news. Maybe Adrienne, you want to start? And then since you're unmuted first.
Sure, I wasn't sure. Thank you. I'm happy to start. I think it's interesting because I've written about conspiracy theories throughout my career, and sort of over the past 15 plus years, and it sort of has evolved from sort of fringe interest that people are like, oh, that's funny, Adrienne cares about that, to something that is very mainstream in a scary way. And I think my interest started really alongside the arrival of the internet, and just watching, for me as a young journalist, as conspiracy theories spread in this new way. Like for me, it had always been sort of a word of mouth phenomenon and sort of an interesting sort of entertaining curiosity, but to see them spread online became clearly something different. And then over the course of my career, they sort of cropped up in interesting moments. You know, post 9/11 was sort of this moment where we saw I think arguably the first widespread distribution of conspiracy theories related to a major global news event. And then, you know, there was Birtherism, which I covered as a reporter in Honolulu, and sort of saw up close this circus and expecting the sort of a fever to break, and then it didn't, and covered the Sandy Hook shooting, and there were awful conspiracy theories that sort of came out of that. And so it's just been something that, you know, as a journalist, sort of alongside every story I've covered, they've sort of cropped up in interesting and alarming ways, and I've been drawn to them for that reason.
Interesting. James.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sophia, for having us this evening. And thank you also to the Beitler Center and to our wonderful host at Penn. It's great to be here with all of you guys this evening. I really appreciate that. I mean, in answer to your question, I would say, you know, for me, it's a slightly different approach into all of this. You know, I did my PhD in history and really wanted to be a proper historian, but just could not find a job. And so ended up in journalism as a result of that, and sort of found myself in this position that I didn't really anticipate earlier. But, you know, I had written my PhD, a version of which kind of in recast form became the book that I just published on sort of Dreyfus-era France broadly conceived, which, as I'm sure we'll talk a lot about, is all about, you know, these kind of militarized conspiracy theories, et cetera. And it just became interesting because this was around the time when a lot of things started happening. You know, there was Brexit in the summer of 2016. There was, like Adrienne mentioned already at that time, the sort of the Birtherism movement in the US, which kind of metastasized into the kind of momentum behind the Trump campaign, which then, of course, won our election in 2016. And so it just occurred to me that there was a lot of connections, there were a lot of connections to be drawn between the history that I had looked at, and that, as you and many others have looked at, of course, as well, and the events that we were witnessing in our own times. And again, you know, I'm sort of not entirely convinced about the value of historical parallels in informing the moment that we live in, because I think that, you know, they get us only so far, but they do, you know, I think they can in certain instances illuminate certain things. But yeah, that's how I got into it. I think I had I started from a kind of historical perspective, and then found myself having to cover current events and then making the connections that way.
Well, actually, James, let me follow up on that, since you've brought us sort of from the past into the present very directly. And I mean, I agree entirely. There are pros and cons to the approach of sort of rifling through history, looking for parallels, but you've drawn some very interesting ones. Many people have turned to Weimar Germany and the rise of Nazis, and to fascism as the sort of most obvious place to look for both parallels and discontinuities. But you've directed our attention back to the Dreyfus affair, which is partly why we're all here this evening, and to the Third Republic in France in particular, and going as far as, I believe, to call the insurrectionists on January 6th anti-Dreyfusards, which is a great comparison. Can you tell us, though, why you think the Dreyfus affair is a particularly good place to look for some understanding of what's happening today?
Sure. I think, you know, so as I said just now, I don't think it's a perfect analogy, and we can talk more about the sort of the elements that maybe work and that don't work. But as you said, yes, ever since Trump's election, there have been countless pieces and countless, I mean, and at this point, even books written about the overtones of Nazism, of Weimar, the list goes on. And some of it does resonate, I think. I mean, it's not to say that it doesn't have anything to say about our moment. What interested me the most about the Dreyfus affair, aside from the fact that it was the background to the dissertation that I wrote, and so therefore kind of more available to me as a reference point, was just that, I think that the Third Republic, i.e., just in case anybody with us tonight is not aware of that, the kind of governmental regime in France between 1870 and 1940, it offers a kind of longue durée view of a system in crisis and plagued by the sort of, if I may, the embrace of surreality. Whereas, something like Weimar, it has a shorter duration and it's followed by this sort of epic conflagration at the end. And it's extremely dramatic in a way that, yes, our situation is also dramatic, but I don't know. I mean, we're not quite at that level of extremity just yet. And so I thought that the Third Republic offered, that side of things that maybe relates to our situation a little bit more. I mean, the other thing is the Dreyfus moment, broadly conceived. I mean, it really does, I think, and I'm not the only one to point this. I believe Anne Applebaum also wrote a great piece on this in the Atlantic, and others have said the same. But I really am convinced that the kind of insane level of bifurcation that happened at that moment in fin de siècle France about, yes, the role or I mean, rather the perceived role of this Jewish military captain in treason, which turned out, of course, to be a huge lie, but the way that it really divided families and every sort of social community that people lived in at that time, almost, I mean, sort of beyond the pale of salvation, I mean, really strikes me as similar to the moment that we are entering in the US, where we live in two sort of adjacent realities, but ultimately irreconcilable. And that's exactly what Dreyfus-era France seems to have been. And so, I don't know, that's what attracted me to that particular analogy the most. But as I said, there are other things about it that don't work out so well in explaining our moment. But in answer, without rambling too much more, that's where I was coming from.
No, I think that's what we're all most interested in, sort of what elements are novel and particular to our particular configurations today, technology, social life, and which elements are sort of perennial. And that's why this conversation is potentially so interesting. And I think I'll use that to ask a question of both of you, maybe starting with Adrienne, since she's written extensively about conspiracy theory at various moments, including a big piece on QAnon last year. And the question is also related to the Dreyfus affair, which of course, one of the central elements is anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering whether you see anti-Semitism, and talking about the sort of content now of conspiracy theories today, as anti-Semitism as still a kind of key piece, sometimes allied with anti-globalization or anti-cosmopolitanism. Think of QAnon as an amalgam of all sorts of things, or whether anti-Semitism is no longer a kind of central strain as it has been for much of Christian conspiracy thinking for centuries, and has been replaced by other kinds of xenophobias or other kinds of attention to other outgroups. And I'm interested in, for both of you, really, whether you think anti-Semitism is a central part of what's happening right now and how that connects to historical anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think absolutely it is. And it's, the more you look at contemporary conspiracy theories, and you mentioned QAnon, which is sort of like this conspiracy theory that eats other conspiracy theories as it goes. It just sort of takes them all in and is very tolerant of all kinds of contradictions. But you see the narratives, the same narratives that sort of are anti-Semitic within QAnon, that are, to your point, anti-elitist, anti-globalist. They talk about, specifically like killing of babies and eating baby things that like very cleanly lift up from the anti-Semitic tropes and narratives that you had in conspiracy theories going back even to like the Crusades. So these are very ancient prejudices that are very familiar when you sort of know what to look for. It's just the very like blunt, simple anti-Semitism that's recycled again and again over the centuries. I'll leave it to James to speak to how that factored into the Dreyfus affair, but I think to me, it's very clearly a part of this. It doesn't mean that there aren't also other prejudices that are roped in, again, because of the nature of how these things spread and how much they sort of take from one another. It's pretty amorphous, but there's no question that anti-Semitism is still core to conspiracy theory culture.
I think it's an excellent question. And on this, I might draw on some of the reporting that I've also done in recent years over here. And yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. In a way, anti-Semitism is sort of the mother of all conspiracy theories, isn't it? I mean, or a sort of a point of departure for so many future conspiracy theories. And we see it all the time. I mean, like a great example would be, something that I've certainly reported on a lot in recent years. I'm sure Adrienne has as well. But this would be the Great Replacement. The notion that, first of all, this is a French invention, as a lot of it still is, even now. But the notion that France's and Europe's broadly conceived kind of white Christian populations are being actively, replaced, like ethnically substituted by migrant influxes from North Africa and West Africa. And by that, most people who use the theory mean Muslim immigrants. And even still, even in that theory, which is openly Islamophobic, as we know, and of course there have been, the Christchurch killings, or sorry, the Christchurch murders of 2 mosques in 2019 there, in the name of this theory. But even still, in that theory, which is kind of structurally Islamophobic, it's the figure of the Jew who is the middleman, who is somehow facilitating the Great Replacement. And it's so striking that even a theory that is somehow about someone else as the culprit still sort of needs to rely on this age-old discourse that has been around forever as a means of legitimacy. It's very strange. And then another thing I would say in Europe that we see all the time, and in the US, at least in the past couple of years with increasing frequency, is the Soros conspiracy. And I mean, I don't even need to explain the anti-Semitic connotations of that. But essentially this is, I mean, to return to what I was just saying, I mean, it's that George Soros, this sort of Jewish billionaire financier, is actively responsible for the destruction of, whether it's countries like Hungary or, in the American context, the United States, through, any number of means, whether it's forced migration or any other number of crimes attributed to him. And it's all, I mean, it's all, but it's interesting how the theories are somewhat new in the sense of like what the emphasis might be, but actually they're kind of these, how they say that there were sort of 7 basic plots in Hollywood. These are not that original. I mean, they're the same theories that we've heard forever and ever and ever, just recast and kind of respun in ways that somehow make them interesting to people today, given the world that we live in. But yes, I think you're absolutely right to say that in a way, the anti-Semitism that we've always known and that, yes, was present in the Dreyfus affair, although in a slightly different way, I would say, but it's still the point of departure for so much of this conspiratorial thinking.
It's really actually fascinating how conspiracy thinking, as you say, has only a certain number of plot lines and only a certain number of forms. And in terms of content, it keeps resuscitating itself with new elements, as both of you are pointing out. I wonder if you'd see patterns as well in how conspiracy theories develop and blossom and come to fruition. And this is where I'm thinking of Adrienne's work, particularly. She's written a lot about Facebook and about its founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, as well as I noticed about Jack Dorsey of Twitter. And you've said very recently that Facebook is not a website, not a publisher, not a platform. not a social network or a corporation, which are how we generally categorize it, but rather it's really a, quote, hostile foreign power. And moreover, you've called it an autocratic one at that. And first of all, I'd love to hear some description as to why we should think of Facebook more as basically a nation state than anything else. But beyond that, I am wondering how much credence both of you give to technology, and especially new technology and the business models attached to it, as being the real catalyst here, the thing that's really made conspiracy theories, including ones that look pretty antiquated, take off. And so in short, is social media really to blame for our current predicament? Not a traditional feature of conspiracy theory, certainly.
I think I'll start with that last question you just asked, which is, my response to that is, it's not to blame for conspiracy thinking, because humans just are predisposed to conspiracism. And we know that it's part of who we are. I think in part, the sort of innocent side of it is that, like, we love storytelling. We're a storytelling species, and we're drawn to narrative. Narrative is how we make sense of the world. And so all of the reasons why people, fall down rabbit holes and are interested in conspiracy theories, it's not all malicious, even though so many of these conspiracy theories can in fact be harmful and hateful. To the question of social media's role, though, I think you see, going back centuries, you might have had a single preacher who went town to town spreading conspiracy theories. And yes, that worked. It got them, it spread them throughout a region, but the scale and the effectiveness that social media allows for is just totally unprecedented in technological history. I mean, not just because a single individual can be spreading something maliciously, but it's just sort of it's not a nonlinear form of communication. So you're talking about just the amplification of the network structure itself, and then also the sort of weight of the algorithm, which is opaque to users, but that we know is sort of primed for engagement. And so the way that Facebook is designed is to get people to react, to keep them engaged. And we know that conspiracy theories are among the sort of content that does that very effectively, because it sucks people in, it makes them angry, it inspires them to share it. And so I think certainly the social web, or these giant social platforms, have responsibility for what's proliferated across their platforms, and that they have historically taken a very hands-off approach to. But the sort of deeper question of, like, conspiracy theories in the first place, like, that's just part of who we are as humans, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. What about this question of why we should think of Facebook in particular as closer to a hostile state than a corporation that sucks a lot of our time?
Sure. So, I mean, I spent years arguing that Facebook was a media company. And for a really long time, I just wanted Mark Zuckerberg to be like, you know what, you're right. Like, we're curating stuff. We're acting as a publisher, basically. And more recently, I've come to think of it differently because, I mean, for a couple of reasons. There's just the sheer scale. So we're talking about a company that has material influence on the cognition of 2.9 billion users, which is just totally staggering if you think about this as not a business that you're wandering into, but a space that people occupy, which it really is. People use it for all different facets of their lives. They conduct their businesses on Facebook. They talk to their family and friends on Facebook. They get their information from Facebook. It sort of watered down people's ability to even know where information is coming from. And so just the staggering scale of the thing, the sort of disaggregated community nature of it, really, I think the argument that I made in this piece is that we shouldn't be thinking about it as a utility or a company or publisher or any of these sort of easy metaphors we have from earlier eras, but that more than anything, especially given its power, we should be thinking about it as a country. And I mean, it's an imperfect example. Obviously, Facebook doesn't have a military, but and there's other reasons it's an imperfect example, but it's just, for me, it's a useful framework to really put into perspective the power that a single company and a single executive wields over billions of people across the world.
It's a very provocative and an interesting metaphor, I think, definitely. James, how do you see social media and its role? And it might be interesting even thinking about the difference from earlier forms of media too.
No, I think it's such an interesting question, and I also find Adrienne's conceit of Facebook as this hostile foreign power fascinating. I had not thought of that before, so I'll have to chew on that one for a bit. But I guess just thinking about the role of social media in conspiracy theories, what it does and what it doesn't do, I would say, in a sense, what it does is give community to mediocrity. And by that, I mean that, you know, for me at least, and maybe maybe you both and some of our viewers disagree, but I really have come to see, you know, conspiratorial thinking and the, you know, the willing embrace of conspiracy theories as some kind of excuse for mediocrity in one's life, you know, i.e. my life did not turn out as I expected it to, or as I feel entitled to. You know, I didn't get the job because of X reason, or, oh, you know, I was supposed to be like at this level because this is where my family has always been, but I'm only here. And it's somebody's fault, but it's never my fault, right? It's always some sort of, there's always some reason that avoids personal accountability, I think. And it's that sort of type of thinking that leads to the embrace of these conspiracy theories. I mean, it certainly was the case, I think, for a lot of the anti-Dreyfusards on this sort of, I mean, I was a student of Ruth Harris, who has written about a lot of this in the lens of sort of emotion. And so I'm very interested in that. And I think that I think that there's a lot there. And so, I mean, obviously it's complicated. There are other reasons to embrace conspiracy theories as well. But I do think for a lot of just sort of average people that don't have some sort of obvious political motive, this is one major reason that conspiracy theories are so attractive. And as such, Facebook and these other platforms that we have, and there are now so many of them, they offer a means of access to other people who might feel the same way. That's easier to find than you might have had, you know, 20 years ago when we didn't have these technologies available. So there wasn't that sort of obvious community where you just go in front of your computer like we're doing now and type something in and then find, you know, all of a sudden 300 people who feel exactly the same way you do about whatever grievance you may have. And it really, I think it does give a community to that sense of kind of militarized mediocrity, if you will.
That's a good expression, militarized mediocrity. To keep that one in mind. Yes, it is interesting to think about the cultural conditions, even the emotional mood into which, for sure, this technology has come to play such a role. You mentioned the decadence in the past of fin de siècle French culture as a factor, and there a host of different factors have been pointed to as responsible beyond social media for our current situation, from economic inequality to residential segregation to apathy, all sorts of things. But I want to ask you particularly about one you both know a lot about, clearly, which is the press. And in this past year or two, the press has had really two different faces. One is the one the Times and the Washington Post tout as sort of the thing that will keep truth in center in our lives and is playing a rather heroic role. And then there's been a lot of discussion about whether the press has in fact helped spread conspiracy theories, either amplifying them by discussing them or taking a kind of value neutral approach where you report everything as, you know, one side and the other. And I'm curious where you see the press in all of this, and maybe how it's affected your own work as reporters, because I imagine it's a really difficult job to do at the moment.
I can take a stab at that one first. I think it's complicated, right? I think first of all, we journalists, or people generally tend to talk about the press or the media sort of in a monolithic way, and in practice, that's not. We're all in different newsrooms or individual journalists making our own moment-to-moment ethical and journalistic decisions, and they obviously add up to something larger culturally. And so I think, on balance, I don't know the extent to which the press has hurt or not in terms of conspiracy theories. I think I am of the mind that our job as reporters and journalists is to shine a light on things as they are, to not shy away from describing them, even in sort of moral terms where necessary. It's definitely, this is sort of a facet of magazine journalism in particular, but it's not a one side says this, the other side says this. This is what we're seeing, and this is, what you need to know. And I believe the public deserves, not to be shielded because a journalist is worried that they can't handle it or it's harmful. All of that being said, we do have to think about our role as amplifiers, as stewards of various platforms of our own. And so, and the other piece I just add to this is I think about the tone of coverage and the extent to which, you see a lot of coverage that's very snarky and sort of mocks conspiracy theorists. And to me, like, that might be cathartic for the journalist, or that might be entertaining to read, but ultimately, I don't know that approach is productive, and arguably, I would say it is harmful. It's not that you want to be sympathetic to people who are carrying out an insurrection, but it's that I think we as journalists and as humans have an obligation to try to understand one another and try to sort of lean into the complexity rather than sort of take a surface level, just sort of mocking or dismissive approach.
Yeah, that sounds great to me too. Yeah, James.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. And honestly, like, I really don't know what I think about that. I mean, over the last couple of years, I mean, I've had I would say the misfortune of spending time with people like Jean-Marie Le Pen, the kind of patriarch of the French far right, and multi-convicted Holocaust denier, his daughter and his granddaughter, who in many ways is more kind of ideologically possessed than either her aunt or her grandfather is. I've been to the chateau where Renaud Camus, the kind of father of the Great Replacement, lives in the Southwest French countryside. And I mean, and all of these have resulted in long articles that I've done in which, like Adrienne just mentioned, I have tried to, of course, surround with context, but to explain and understand. And I'm not sure that's good enough. I'm not sure it works. I really don't know. I mean, I understand the impulse not to insult and to dismiss, but ultimately that is what the conspiracy theorist is doing to us. And here I think of I think there's a brilliant passage in the book that Sartre wrote about anti-Semitism. I guess it's been translated as Reflections on the Jewish Question. And he says that, I mean, I'm not going to be able to do it verbatim, but it's essentially that, discussing in good faith with the anti-Semite is impossible, because the anti-Semite by definition is a bad faith actor, and the entire purpose is to insult our intelligence. And engaging with a person like that is to kind of be complicit in that insult. And I think that's quite right. And I've just come to see that, I mean, maybe it doesn't need to be, like Adrienne was saying, some sort of snide kind of one-off write-up, but I'm not really sure that, and again, I have no answers, but I'm just saying, as somebody who has been with these people and who has had to produce these write-ups, and I'm not sure I did a good enough job cutting off the oxygen. And I think that we could all think more about what it is that we are really doing, and whether we are really explaining or understanding, or whether we are just humoring these people who, by the way, all know exactly what they are doing.
Can I jump in, not to take your job from you, Sophia, but I'm curious because I've thought about this a lot, like in the context of birtherism. So before Trump was president, and he was establishing his sort of political star as it was rising, his whole, as everyone probably remembers, his whole mode was to call into question Barack Obama's US citizenship. And my thought at the time, this was in 2011 or so, was, as a journalist, just ignore it. The fever will break. This is madness. Like, the truth wins out, basically. But my lesson there was, it's not enough to assume that the truth is good enough. And so I'm with you totally that part of the problem there certainly was the oxygen that was given to this whole narrative by cable TV and others, and frankly from the sort of like Jon Stewarts of the world too. But if we shouldn't just totally ignore them, but we shouldn't be overly empathetic. Like, and I know you said you didn't have answers, James, but I do wonder, where does that leave us? And what obligation do we have the public to wrestle with what's happening around us?
James,
Well,
do you want to say another word about that? Because this is a fascinating conversation.
Sure. I mean, again, like as I said, I don't have any answers, but to me, I think the question is, I mean, first of all, like, how newsworthy is the conspiracy theory, right? And I'm sure this is something that you have thought more about, Adrienne, than I have thought about. But I mean, that to me seems like the starting point, right? So, and again, I can only speak here to my own experience, which has been covering, French politics. But it turns out that there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are sort of embedded in that particular storyline. I mean, Marine Le Pen was the candidate for president the last time around, and she got 35% of the vote. I mean, that's really jarring. And this time around, I mean, he hasn't officially declared his candidacy yet, but Eric Zemmour, who is a sort of open historical revisionist, is doing very well in the polls. I mean, we'll see what happens. But I mean, these are people who, both in their own way, have huge followings and actively seek to revise, and not even revise, but really reconstruct the record of a past that we know to be true, because it doesn't suit their narrative of what this nation is or ought to be. And, I just am not sure that the answer is to grapple with where they're coming from and why they feel they need to do that. I mean, it's interesting, I guess, for us as reporters to know, but ultimately it's just a lie. And I agree with you that, yes, I also, believed that, the truth would win out. But I mean, I guess, on this particular French beat, when I talk about historical revisionism, that is a polite way of saying that what I'm talking about is Holocaust denial. And the truth is that that is a movement that is not weakening with time, ironically. I mean, despite the fact that we now have very serious and wonderful museums in pretty much every major Western European and kind of major city in the United States. I mean, ironically, as those museums have been established, and they do such good work that's so important, but it hasn't necessarily stopped this movement, which continues apace to deny what happened and to recast these narratives that we tell ourselves about where we come from. And I don't know. I mean, I now wonder, how interesting is it to delve into the question of what makes these people tick, because I kind of think we know what makes them tick, and it's just not that interesting. And we know what the result is, and it's just really dangerous.
It's an incredible conundrum. I mean, it's essentially the same conundrum as fact-checking, right? But fact-checking is so important, and yet fact-checking elevates the false information and makes its prominence more pronounced. I mean, and what to do about it. It's very interesting to hear you both kind of wrestle with precisely that question of how much to report and what to report. So I guess, and I want to urge the audience at this point to please start putting your own questions into the Q&A. I have just a few more things I'd like to find out, but I really would like to hear what the audience wants to know from our two esteemed guests. And I guess James's last remarks lead me to this question, which is kind of what can be done then? How do mass delusions come to an end? I mean, one might think whether in the past, say, how did the Dreyfus period end? And maybe what can be done to hasten this process? Is it, if the press can't do it, is it something states can do, individuals can do? Is it a question of regulating social media? What can we do to, in a sense, correct our course? And don't say nothing, because that's too depressing a note to end on.
I'm actually working on a piece about this very question, and I'm only in the middle of my reporting, so I can't promise answers. Even when I'm finished my reporting, I'm not sure I'll promise answers, but I guess the one observation I'll share from sort of my current thinking is I went into this question of how do we come out of this? Like, how does the fever break? I went into it thinking like, okay, over the next couple of years, how do we pull ourselves out? And through my reporting and conversations, and I'm really curious, James, to hear what you think about this, given your Dreyfus affair expertise, I've really come to the view that, this isn't actually something to break or to just sort of pluck ourselves out of, but rather something to endure. And and I know you've both cautioned against the sort of like looking too hard for historic parallels, but I think we do have good sort of touch points in history to know that, there are moments where conspiracism is more pronounced, and sort of the same conditions that sort of led to those moments may exist today. And how do we get through it, maybe not unscathed but undestroyed, which is a bit depressing to put it that way. But I do think it's sort of like, we've already seen real world violence come from conspiracism. And so I think to me the question is, how do we prevent more bloodshed? And I think, of course I would say this because I'm fixated on the social web, but I do think looking at information systems is one of the major things here. And there is a population of people who like have a worldview, whatever the conspiracy theory is, just sort of neatly can sort of be placed onto it. And it's not as though we can change people's minds, but I think we can create infrastructure, whether informational or otherwise, to keep people safe, or certainly to do a better job than we are now. And I could get into some more examples, but I think I want to hear what James has to say before I go on.
Maybe you'll come back with an example for us then. Good, because I would like to hear more too. James.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I look forward to reading that piece when it comes out. I'm not really sure. Just to return to Sophia's original question about, how, thinking about all of this in the context of the Dreyfus affair. One thing to point out about the Dreyfus affair is that it didn't. Yes, Dreyfus was exonerated eventually, and that all sort of ended legally. But I wouldn't say that the affair ended. Essentially, France remained divided. The anti-Dreyfusards become sort of, mobilized politically. The anti-Semitism remains as bad and arguably gets much worse in the years to come. And so the whole notion of this kind of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory doesn't evaporate. And I worry that where we are, which is again, a very different moment from the France of the fin de siècle, will also not necessarily end, so to speak. I don't think these things end, like Adrienne was saying. I think that we kind of have to endure it. And now the question is like, how do we do that? Adrienne would know more than I would. I think that essentially there's not much to do except just try and defend the truth as best you can, how you can, and not to unwittingly amplify the lies when you know them to be lies.
Adrienne, do you want to say anything further about the sort of maybe the specificity of what you have in mind?
Yeah, I think just to look at the social web, I think what's needed and what's deserved, what the public deserves, is far more transparency about how our informational environment works. So taking the example of Facebook, though you could apply this to any social platform really, like why don't we get to see what's most viral, like what's most amplified or spreading most rapidly at any given point? Why don't we have better insight into how different algorithms across different social platforms weight different kinds of interactions? Like if you can't fully reverse engineer an algorithm because it's incredibly complicated and taking in all different inputs and showing different users all different versions of that platform. But we can see, or we would be able to, if these companies would agree to it, better transparency into sort of the overall nature of what's being shared and when and how and to whom and in what regions. And I think just like very basic transparency of that nature would begin to sort of, lift the curtain a bit on how these environments work and how they manipulate us. And that isn't enough to necessarily stop violence, but like better understanding what we're swimming in would at least be like a very basic and I think like publicly necessary and deserved starting point.
Mhm. Well, your comments on this last question have provoked a flurry of responses from the audience, which is terrific. And a lot of people are asking very specifically about kind of remedies and endings. But let me start with reading some of the questions from the audience, because there are a lot of terrific ones that have come in just the last few minutes. And please, if there's still time to add your own, if you're mulling something over. But let me read you one that takes us in a little bit different direction, that asks something more about the responsibility of intellectual elites and political elites and academics in particular for all of this, whom I don't think we want to let off the hook entirely either. And the question goes as follows. One perspective on conspiracy theory is that it represents a certain kind of empowerment of the non-elite. Facebook itself could be regarded as the democratization of the media. Everyone's a publisher and a newscaster. What implications does this have for the public engagement of the elite, specifically academia? Do academics have new responsibilities that we need to prepare for? A question asked at a university, really about, right? About, the same question I'm asked about you as reporters, really asked about what can other kinds of people who work in knowledge industries do?
I mean, I'll quickly take I think this person is absolutely right that it's one of the major sort of impetus you see among people who are drawn to conspiracism is a feeling of anti-establishment and a feeling of sort of them against the world, and certainly a positioning against perceived elites. And on the Facebook point, I think that's absolutely right, that we could see it as democratization of publishing, but it's not actually, because it's controlled by a single company. So true democratization of publishing, which we should all fight for because the freedom of the press belongs to every individual, not just professional journalists, would be an open web or a system where there are multiple social platforms with, transparency into how they work and not simply a single powerful company controlling people's sort of access to exercise their right to free press. So that's my view on that piece of it. But in terms of academia, I mean, you're both probably better positioned to speak to that question than I am.
James, do you have thoughts about sort of, and I would extrapolate from academia to really all people who are in scientists, researchers, anybody who's sort of producing some form of elite knowledge these days?
Well, no, I was going to say I would really be interested to hear your answer to that question.
You're supposed to be the moderator.
I know, but that's really a question for you. I mean, I don't really know what to say, except I mean, just kind of the obvious sort of general point, which is that yes, like there is this perception about like the elite kind of however you want to call it, like knowledge producing industries, i.e. academia and others, being sort of exclusive and sort of against but this is just kind of one of the reasons why I think it's so imperative that we in these institutions, whatever these institutions may be, whether it's universities, newspapers, museums, magazines, be as transparent as possible about how we bring in new members of our own teams and be as inclusive as we can be in recruiting them. And I think that's really important to, be as aggressive as we can about reflecting the makeup of the societies in which we operate. I would say that's a really good starting point. And I mean, I know a lot of institutions have done a lot of work on that to date, but there's always more to be done, and in some cases, a lot more to be done. So,
yes, and I won't go on this point, but I agree entirely that experts shouldn't be let off the hook immediately. That experts can produce their own forms of exclusivity and anti-democratic behavior, and I think James, you're on the right track with that. I'm going to change directions a little bit just because the questions I have coming in are on so many different topics. And this one might be also for James, but maybe for both of you. This is really about the content of conspiracy theories again. Does the history of the blood libel shed any light on the transmission of conspiracy theory and perhaps a way to tamp it down? This is again about the sort of elements that have been combined into today's conspiracy thinking. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I would have to think about that at greater length, but I mean, again, look, I mean, the blood libel is one of the most well-known and age-old conspiracy theories. And I mean, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, as if that needs to be said. So, I mean, I think absolutely, especially in the way that it just kind of appears in multiple different national contexts across sort of different historical moments, essentially seamlessly, with a lot of the same tropes just sort of being repeated. I mean, in some ways kind of recast and made to fit specific, local situations. But yes, I think that it really does, that it shows that there is kind of, like a kind of collective unconscious for some of these, like the storylines are written already and they just sort of appear in different terms in different places. But you kind of heard the story before, even if you know nothing about the place where it comes from, which is what I find so interesting about conspiracy theories. I think absolutely, though, the blood libel does teach us a lot.
Adrienne, I don't know if you want to comment on that or not. Okay.
I think I agree. That's all.
Okay, fine. I just want to make sure that everybody's had a chance to jump in. A number of people have asked about different kinds of historical analogies. I'll read you some. And one question is, would we see current conspiracy theory differently if we chose the conspiracy theories crafted during the French Revolution as a point of comparison? And another question asks, for historians, past examples of conspiracy thinking that come to mind include, this is about France, the famine plot conspiracy of the 18th century, the Great Fear of 1789, the fear of aristocrats during the Terror. Can you see any analogies between these forms of conspiratorial thinking that led to important incidents of violence and numerous killings and contemporary events in America? Might you be excessively narrowing your category of conspiracy theories by focusing so much on anti-Semitism or conspiracy theory? And of course, we did start with the Dreyfus affair, which has in some sense shaped the conversation. There are others too that ask about a variety of his issues connected to Catholic history and Judeo-Masonic conspiracies during the Vichy period and other such questions. So that would really come back to this question, maybe Adrienne's broader one, about whether conspiracy thinking is sort of always and everywhere, or whether there are particular lines that we need to pay attention to today. But if either of you wants to tackle this kind of long history of conspiracy thinking, I think the audience would be interested.
I mean, I could chime in just to say, I think I have also been thinking a lot about the French Revolution, and I unfortunately don't have any like very clearly formed thoughts to share, other than it does seem like a striking moment in history, in part just because of, like we were just talking about, the anti-elite sentiment of the time. And my current preoccupation with sort of trying to figure out, like, how do we go the path that doesn't lead to further bloodshed? I'm interested in sort of like, what are the moments in history that did lead to bloodshed? What are the similarities? And then, what can we learn from them to hopefully try to prevent that from happening again? So I'm not sure what more to say, other than that I agree that that's, there's a lot in French history actually that's really resonant for me. And just throwing out there that I'm reading this book that this crowd might find interesting called The Great Cat Massacre.
Yes.
You probably maybe are familiar with it, but it's great. And it's sort of the other thing that I like about this book that sort of is a note of caution about sort of which moments in history to go to, is it really has highlighted for me how cultural context kind of evaporates over time. And of course, like many of you here are probably historians and know this, but it calls to mind for me the extent to which, today's conspiracy theories are so complicated and require so much knowledge of in-group language and these sort of cues and understanding sort of the roots and trajectory and anti-Semitic narratives or not, or whatever narratives they may be, that it makes me wonder about which sort of conspiracy theories from past eras are hiding in plain sight, and we don't have the proper cultural context to really understand what they meant or how we could learn from them. So that's open-ended, but I share your interest in the French Revolution and all of this as well.
James, do you want to add anything on that question?
I think Adrienne said basically just what I would say as well.
Okay, fine. And yes, I would urge people who haven't read The Great Cat Massacre, Robert Darnton, to read it as one of the, in some sense, great works of French history of the last, I don't know how many decades now. So a number of the questions go not to history, but very much to the present, and particularly to both of your remarks on tech companies and media, and a lot of interest in that. And one question is certainly about Fox News, etc., not surprisingly. And there are questions about the for-profit status of and why conspiracies money making. Let me read you some of these. Let's see if I can find them all now. Now there are enough questions that it's hard to find them all. Let me see. Sorry. Well, then while I'm looking, here's one. What about consolidation of news, Murdoch, etc., and Fox News, and the amplification of lies? What about the role of money and profit? Doesn't Fox News make a mint repeating these conspiracies incessantly? And then somebody asked later on, isn't Facebook two companies? One, a US public utility, which the public must now regulate and govern, and the other an international platform which does nothing to prevent the use of the platform by gangsters, drug traffickers, open ultranationalists, etc. And so I think all of these questions are sort of skeptical as to whether these private actors are likely to be a help or a hindrance in the process of changing our political culture.
I have thoughts, but James, you should go first since I went first last time, if you'd like.
No, by all means, go ahead. I mean, I think you would know much more about this than I would, so I'll follow.
Okay, so I think these are great and totally fair questions. I think with the disclaimer that I lead a for-profit news organization, and my belief is that society is healthier when people are invested in journalism. Again, I would say that, but I really do believe that I worry about a future where all news organizations are not for profit, because then you're relying on, in many cases, just very wealthy benefactors to keep them going, who have their own there's another power dynamic there. And so that's part of it. But I think it's right to be skeptical of, it's right to understand who is running different news organizations and what their motivations might be. Not necessarily from ownership. Hopefully most news organizations have editorial independence, but certainly not all do. And then on the Facebook point, I think absolutely agree with the person who put it, or sort of another way that I would put it is there are many different versions of Facebook. So certainly we have there are all different versions for every different user because of the algorithm, but you could say there's one version of Facebook that America uses, and then globally, there are countries where Facebook is the de facto internet because that's how people get online. And these are countries where they're only on the mobile web, and it's just a much different picture from what most of us experience here. And so I think it speaks to the unwieldy nature of these platforms and how powerful they are, and also how important it is to sort of look at them as dynamic. So I don't know if I fully answered the question, but those are my immediate reactions.
James, do you have thoughts about this sort of the for-profit status question? Because I also have some questions for you from the audience about French politics. So
yeah, I mean, again, like I work at the Washington, or write for the Washington Post. So I mean, I'm not a great strategist of sort of media and its place in society. I just am somebody who writes for a newspaper. But I mean, I would say I mean, I agree with Adrienne. I think ultimately, yes, like the for-profit model does pose questions, but ultimately, yeah, I mean, I think a lot is like Adrienne was saying, like it is good to some extent when people are engaged in maintaining these institutions, despite all that can go wrong with that. But yeah, other than that, I really don't have anything profound to say. I mean, this is not really my area, but I'm happy to.
Can I ask you then some questions about, some of the audience is really curious about your remarks about Zemmour and others. And
yes, of course.
So one of them is this is for James especially. You do not seem to distinguish French anti-Semitism during the Dreyfus affair, the 1930s, and World War II, mostly coming from the right, and today's anti-Semitism, which is sometimes rooted in anti-Zionism or Islamism. And that's a question about how do you see the anti-Semitism of Zemmour in that context? And another one says, what does Renaud Camus think is behind the conspiracy to replace Europeans with non-white people? What is his proposed solution? Is he an anti-Semite?
Mhm.
In other words, questions about various strains of anti-Semitism in France
Yes.
today.
I mean, these are all excellent questions. Thank you to whoever among the audience posed them. Let me start with Zemmour, and then we can do Renaud Camus. So yes, whoever asked the question, you are absolutely right. The anti-Semitism of the fin de siècle, and indeed of Vichy and the Holocaust and that period, is very different than a lot of the anti-Semitism you see in France today. It's a totally different discourse, a totally different narrative, and it doesn't necessarily map onto each other. They don't necessarily map onto each other very well at all. And as you said today, yes, the sort of anti-Zionist strain and the kind of Islamist strain is very pronounced, and indeed has been responsible for the anti-Semitic or the I would say the largest number of anti-Semitic attacks that we've seen in recent years. But with Zemmour, it is in a way complicated, because was not just in a way, in many ways it's complicated. I mean, for one, Zemmour himself is Jewish, as we all know, and speaks about anti-Semitism exclusively in the context of this sort of Islamist anti-Semitism. So as he said on television the other day, now Jews are killed in the streets of France, not with the cries of Heil Hitler, but with Allahu Akbar. And so for him, the question of anti-Semitism is only interesting vis-a-vis the Islamist question. And it's also worth pointing out that Zemmour makes no distinction, and indeed has rejected the distinction between Islam and Islamism, which is a huge question in France, sort of always and forever anyway. So what I would say, though, that's really, really kind of upsetting, and I say this as somebody who has a kind of typical American Jewish background myself, is that Eric Zemmour, who has all of the fine, I mean, yet he's right. There is anti-Semitism among certain segments of the community that he is always talking about. That's a reality. But this is the same man who, in the same token of or in the same sort of turn of phrase, will say that Philippe Pétain was actively involved with rescuing French Jews in the Holocaust, that Vichy wasn't so bad, that we should stop feeling so bad about ourselves and stop sort of self-flagellating. And that is, I mean, that's just ridiculous, patently false, and offensive, and also a form, or at least it gives purchase to the sort of age-old Catholic bourgeois anti-Semitism that, by the way, never evaporated, despite how unfashionable it became after the war. And the thing about Zemmour is that, I mean, my sense is that, there is in France, despite the popularity that Le Pen achieved in the last election, there is a kind of asterisk next to that name, in the sense that, people really find it somehow unelectable and distasteful because of the whole sort of association of the family and that sort of whole rhetoric. But with the truth is, what Zemmour shows is that if you find a sort of aesthetically pleasing, and indeed he speaks very well, he dresses like a partner at a white shoe law firm, he looks like the ideal son-in-law. And if you appear that way, you can say whatever you want. And it turns out that he's kind of the expression of this national id that, he says things that people feel, apparently, or a striking number of people feel, but don't feel comfortable saying. And a lot of that is, yes, that there's too much Holocaust memory, that Vichy really wasn't so bad, that it did a lot of good, and that, these people, i.e. the Jews, need to stop complaining so much. And that is very much the pitch. So I would say that it's true to point out that there are different anti-Semitisms in France, and that Zemmour has spoken forcefully about one of them. But I mean, at what price? I would put the question. And then to add to the question about Renaud Camus, is he an anti-Semite? There's been a lot written on this, and I spent a lot of time with him, and my conclusion was, I think perhaps. And why do I say that? Well, he has that sort of reflex of being performatively philo-Semitic, in the sense that, the Great Replacement is so bad, you see, because what we will do if we allow it to continue apace is bring in so many Muslim immigrants, and this will be bad for France's Jewish population that we, must protect at all costs. But, I found in talking to him this very strange, obsession with Jews. And indeed, he's also kind of an aesthete in a kind of, Huysmans kind of way. And the things that he showed me in his house that he was working on, or in the studio that day, it's a whole series of letters from the Hebrew alphabet, and just like things like that everywhere, and in conversation, and it's in the air. And I would say that it's definitely kind of a starting point, and this notion that somehow the Jews are implicated in the theory is definitely sort of an unspoken element of it. The Great Replacement, I mean. Anyway, I'm rambling, but that would be my answer to the question.
No, that was terrific. I'm sure a lot of people are eager to understand more about the strains of French politics, and particularly anti-Semitism in France at the moment. I'm going to change directions a little bit here with a question. There's some wonderful questions have come in. Let me scroll down for a moment. This is an interesting one that asks the question again about sort of what to do about all of this. If one starts with the understanding that there are real problems in the world, growing inequality, inequities that increase harm for excluded populations, a future of global health crises, mass migration, climate change, etc., might we work on solutions that exist and are practical to other problems in order to shrink the appeal, attraction, and stickiness of conspiracies? In other words, a question that asks about the larger framework that makes conspiracy thinking attractive, and asks whether tackling those questions would affect the kinds of things we're also talking about in terms of the content of conspiracy thinking, or the formats in which it's transmitted to the public. Any thoughts on that?
A quick thought is just that I think our informational ecosystem is too complex now to do that. Even in an earlier era where there were press gatekeepers and the nightly news and a limited number of sources for information delivered on your doorstep or broadcast at certain times per day, even then you wouldn't get coordination among media to agree to cover something or not, which I think ultimately is a good thing. I think people, I think we should have that variety, even though sometimes the quality is bad or harmful.
Yeah.
That being so, in addition to that, so not only would coordination have been probably unrealistic in an earlier era, I think today, now that everyone can publish whatever they want to social platforms at any moment, which could be a good thing, but then we have these platforms that reward engagement overall and are primed for their own growth above all, that doubly rewards sort of the content that is harmful, including harmful conspiracy theories. And so I think even if you had an army of people only posting productive, civic-minded material to Facebook, given how the system works, and I'm using Facebook as a stand-in for, include YouTube, Twitter, Google, whatever. Even then, I think the power of the sort of how these systems are designed and how they work, it would work against us. And also, frankly, and to some extent, how human attention works. And this in this environment where that we're just totally saturated and bombarded with information, and there's this sort of conflation between knowledge and information, and people don't have time to sort through what they're encountering even in many cases. So I like the idea in theory, but I fear that it is impractical.
James, do you want to add anything there?
No, I would agree with everything Adrienne just said.
Okay. Well, let me, this is an interesting and somewhat unusual question here, is this one. The emotional dysregulation of conspiracy movements is best met via empathy. That's what Biden offered, and it worked, at least to an extent. Empathy, listening to the needs of others. Those are the negotiating tactics that are known to win. But nonetheless, the ongoing trumpeting of the big lie, obviously about a stolen election, will prove a considerable hurdle in the next election cycle. Do your speakers have anything to say to the perennial emotionality of human thinking, which might be the flip side of telling the truth is ineffective at combating conspiracy movements? Yeah, this is a hard one. And James, you brought up initially how much you think that today's conspiracy theory is driven by resentment and other kinds of emotional drives. And this is a really interesting question of what role emotion might play as an antidote of sorts.
That's an excellent question, and I don't know if I have. I mean, I know I certainly don't have a definitive answer to it. I'm also not convinced I have anything profound to offer. I can tell you what I think as just one person like all of us who is kind of trying to make sense of the moment we live in. And yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the Biden line, as we all are. I wish I could believe that empathy is a sufficient tool in getting us out of the moment we are in. And not only the moment we are in, but I mean, I think what's scary, it's the moment that we've always been in as well. That's another part of the whole equation I think is worth remembering. And look, like I say this as somebody who I am born and raised in Dallas. And I hadn't been there in years because of in about 2 years because of the coronavirus lockdowns, et cetera, and went back recently. And in the nice neighborhood where I grew up now, I mean, I cannot tell you, it's full of these blue line flags, that the don't tread on me, the whole thing about the Capitol riot and all of this. And it's just, it just feels hopeless. And I'm not sure that anything that we can do will take away whatever kind of, I mean, to speak about emotions, whatever kind of emotional thrill those who put up those flags and repeat these phrases seem to derive from doing so. So I don't know. I just it's devastating, and I don't really think there is an empathetic way out of it. I wish I believed that, but I'm not sure I do.
I will say this is maybe hopelessly optimistic, but I have talked to researchers and individuals who've said that the only way to confront this is on an individual level among people who trust each other. So it's really up to, like, if someone's family member has sort of gone down the rabbit hole, or someone in your church community or whatever it may be, that it is possible to engage in a productive way, and that the way to do it, I've heard, and this sort of stands to reason, is through asking questions. And so rather than saying like, oh, why would you believe that? That's totally bananas. Saying like, oh, help me understand why you believe this. How many people would have to be involved for this to be true? And just sort of like gently probing. Again, we're talking about a society-wide phenomenon. And so it perhaps is hopelessly optimistic to think that one person at a time we could make a difference. But if that person's in your family or your community, certainly there's reason to try.
Well, your answer leads me, I'm going to ask the last question of both of you, and it leads nicely to this one. And I'm sorry we won't get to all of them, simply because there are a lot of really interesting questions that go in different directions. But picking up on what Adrienne just said, this seems a fitting conclusion, including the fact that we're talking in the context of a library in an educational institution. And beyond the sort of conversational, do you see a role for education in developing particular skills that would help us deal with information? And I can thinking on my own here beyond that, I think there are really interesting questions about how we might rethink aspects of either elementary education or advanced forms of education. In a sense, thinking about both earlier questions about expertise, but also questions about how do people identify what's true in a world in which we're all sort of swimming in information, and the competition is more for our attention than for anything else. So any thoughts about that as a sort of final wrap up? What kind of habits we might be able to inculcate in people that would help in the future?
I mean, I'll say, I think certainly there's some degree of like information literacy and skepticism to cultivate. But to me, I think the two things that most come to mind are helping people be comfortable with uncertainty and complexity, and sort of pushing back against this notion that not only do you have to have a fully formed point of view, but maybe you also have to be outraged about something you've just encountered. Like, let's sit with uncertainty and discomfort in a way that just like be patient and know that not everything has all the answers. And then the second one is, I think, being not surrounded, but regular encounters with people with whom you disagree and who have different worldviews. Like that to me is so much of this is just the sort of danger of getting a group together who all think the same way is just profound. And so I think for all of, I mean, not just for children or students, but for all of us to be regularly around people who see the world differently than we do is, to me, essential.
Those are terrific suggestions to my mind. James.
Yeah, I would agree, especially with the point about embracing nuance, especially. I think that's really important. But just to echo what Adrienne said at the beginning of her last answer, which is just, I think that given the landscape that we have inherited and that we will continue to live in, what is really important, just on a really proximate level, I would say, aside, of course, from the history of the Dreyfus affair, would be sort of aggressive media literacy training just from the beginning and from a very early age. And I know that that has started. There has been some of that in schools already. I mean, and probably in some places more than others, but I mean, it is happening. So I'm aware of that. But I think that we could be much more committed in that respect, because as you've both mentioned, there is just so much information, and it's not just about discerning what is true and what is reliable. It's also just about, how to read it and how to digest it and what its purpose is. Because like Adrienne says, there is this really strange expectation that you need to have some kind of fully formed reaction to what you encounter, and then to sort of comment on it, which of course you don't. And indeed, no one has asked you to do. But that is sort of the expectation. And I just think that, not only, the obvious thing, what is true, what is false, you'll learn that anyway in school, just with sort of writing research papers or whatever. But just, what the new media technologies produce, what it's for, and how it relates to you, if at all. And I think that's probably a question. Like, another way of putting it would be like, what is the role, what is the position of the individual in this sort of, tidal wave of content that is kind of multiplying by the day, it would seem, would be a good thing to think about too.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both so much for a really interesting set of remarks. And I would say that in some ways, both of you have just contributed to our own general education here this evening on questions of conspiracy thinking and media and historical parallels and the rest. So many thanks to our audience, who must have found this interesting because almost everybody stuck with us, and to the organizers of this event, and to Adrienne and James. And
thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you
so much for having us. This was really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
It was a pleasure. So thank you all and good night.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.